we can start. So hello everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are organizing the second seminar of our seminar series. So tonight we are joined by Richard Falk, who will give a speech entitled as Right of Return, Prospects and Solutions. He has served as UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestine territories for 6 years. He is a renowned international law and international relations expert, author of more than 20 books, and has chaired various organizations, acted as counsel to the International Court of Justice, and currently directs the Global Climate Change, Human Security, and Democracy Project at the Global Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and he's a senior advisor to a project at the Istanbul Policy Center, Sabancı University. So as we are together with Mr. Falk, who will share his vast knowledge on Palestine issue with an attention to the refugee and the right of return theme, I would like to remind to our participants that after the lecture, we will have a question and answer session at the end for half an hour, and you can write your questions to the chat bar, uh, directly to the Afrika Vakfı. So we can start. Mr. Falk, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk with students from your academy. Let me approach this issue, which is, in my view, a core issue not only in understanding the current phase of the conflict, but it also bears centrally on prospects for a viable and sustainable and just solution, so that it's indispensable to understand the complexity that surrounds the attitudes toward refugees and rights of return that are the focus of attention by both Israel and the Palestinians, but from radically different perspectives. Let me make three preliminary points. The first is that in these months since October 7th, when the initial Hamas attack occurred, there has been an understandable preoccupation with the Israeli response a few days later and continuing until now, and showing only ambivalent or ambiguous signs of coming to some kind of ceasefire and halt. It's understandable because this assault by Israel has been a transparent genocide carried out in real time, with the images of atrocities shown throughout the world. And even when they are filtered as they are in the West by a generally pro-Israeli media, they still come across as the occasion of unspeakable suffering for the people of Gaza. So it is natural that the plight of Palestinian refugees has been more or less forgotten, both by those that are perpetuating this criminal course of Israeli violence and by those that are resisting uh, from a pro-Palestinian perspective, because both the Israeli claim to uh, carry on the war, as it's called, until Hamas is utterly destroyed, which turns out to be an unreachable goal, and the Palestinian resistance and solidarity groups that are concerned and preoccupied above all in stopping the genocide and holding those responsible for it to some kind of accountability. So, and this kind of discussion is very needed to overcome a tendency to forget about the refugee dimension of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and even more seriously, to forget about the struggle all along of the Palestinian refugees uh, to uh, to return to their place of uh, origin and to their homeland and to the atmosphere from which they were forced to abandon. Another aspect of this uh, forgotten dimension of the Palestinian struggle, of course, it's not forgotten by the Palestinians, but forgotten to some extent, to a great extent, by the world, is the reality of Gaza itself being understood as essentially itself a refugee community. Very few people, at least in my experience, have understood that 75% of the 2.3 million Gazans are refugees, mainly from the 1948 Nakba, in which 700,000 or more Palestinians were forced to flee their homes and villages and neighborhoods uh, so that Israel could claim a majority Jewish population that would be in a position to create and establish a Jewish uh, ethnic state. So the uh, refugee issue is deeply embedded in the resistance that one has witnessed emanating from Gaza, because perhaps more than in any other part of the occupied territory, the Gazans are themselves victims of the Nakba or catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people in the course of the conflict that ended with uh, Jewish domination and the process by which Israel as a state was established. And one shouldn't overlook the complicity that goes back to the days of struggle that began for the Palestinians long before 1948 of both the liberal democracies of the West that were induced by the Zionist movement to look favorably at the prospect of a Jewish homeland in then British occupied Palestine as the mandatory power after the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the course of World War I. So that one had this experience of solving the European problems of anti-Semitism, climaxing with the Holocaust at the expense of the Palestinian nation, which had nothing to do with the Hitler-Nazi experience, but has suffered the consequences of the defeat of Germany and this establishment of a Jewish state in their homeland. And that's what I would call the original sin of Zionism, was the idea that you can establish in this post-colonial period a settler colonial state without encountering strong and deeply rooted resistance. In other words, embedded in this project to establish a Jewish state was the prospect of a form of racial domination that was supposedly prefigured by the expulsion of those 700,000 or more Palestinians in 1948, and that was augmented by another 300,000 in the course of the 1967 war. Most of those refugees went to Jordan from the West Bank. And then even more recently, the 200,000 or so Palestinians that lost their residence permits and were forced into a refugee camp, of which there are 58 spread around the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank and the neighboring countries of Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. So it's a regional issue beyond being an essential component of the Israel-Palestine problem. And it's a struggle that I want to stress had its beginnings long before the State of Israel was established. And the other preliminary remark that I wish to make is that in the course of this process of settlement and expulsion and domination, Israel was confronted by a choice between redefining its project or persistently and severely violating international law. In other words, there is no legal path to establishing a ethnic state in the homeland of another people. And it's that expression of what Edward Said called Orientalism that is what I'm calling the original sin of Zionism, to make Palestinians at best uh, subjugated strangers in their own homeland, and at worst people who are deprived of their not only their personal roots, but of their national identity and citizenship by being compelled to adopt a refugee status. So I feel this is quite fundamental to the evolution of the conflict between Palestine and Israel, that this uh, systemic disregard of international law was organically embedded in the very nature of the Zionist project. And once you have that uh, disregard, it seems rather superfluous to be obedient or compliant with international law in other settings. Because this initial pattern of violation is both fundamental and it was achieved without any adverse consequences for Israel. It didn't lose the support of the liberal democracies by doing this, by the expulsion of the residents and the accompanying denial of their right of return. The whole purpose of the expulsion was to establish a durable Jewish majority in Palestine. The UN itself has a responsibility for sponsoring a partition of a nation without the consent of the people living in the nation. At a time when self-determination became the most fundamental and inalienable right embedded in the human rights tradition. So there was what one might call a conspiracy of silence about this original sin or a fundamental crime of expulsion and domination, denial the native population of its elementary rights. And the course of the unfolding of the conflict over a long period of time brought to the surface the ideology that has climaxed in this perpetuation of the worst genocide since the Holocaust. The founding president of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, was quoted as saying, um, we want to expel Arabs and take their place. In other words, it was a explicit avowal of what's called by white supremacists in the United States a replacement theory of you replace the dominant group, ethnic group, with your own uh, ethnic identity and its governing process. And as I said earlier, this cannot be done without uh, severe forms of repression, particularly in the rising anti-colonial consciousness of all peoples in the global South. So while the peoples of many African and Asian countries were acquiring their freedom and exercising a right of self-determination, the Palestinian people suffered the exact reverse historical process. And because it went against the flow of history, the repressive character of this domination was more rigorous and has turned into something very cruel, even sadistic. And what is ironic, of course, in the dynamic of expulsion and denial of any right of return, which is also an embedded right of international law and an essential feature of uh, the rights of refugees. As soon as the conditions enable it, refugees have a right to return, that Israelis have systematically and through their domestic law completely repudiated. So that's a second source of disregard of international law. And it's compounded by the unrestricted right of return given to anyone of a Jewish ethnicity. And it is it refutes the common Israeli liberal argument that there are just too many Palestinians to be absorbed by Israel. They had no trouble absorbing the 500,000 Jews expelled by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, I believe. What is also characteristic then of this issues of return, the right of return, which for Palestinians is not only a legal right, but a near sacred moral imperative. Uh, and it sets up this clash that is combined with the openness to Jewish immigration, on which there is imposed no limits. And this was encoded in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed both the Jewishness of the state and the option of Jews everywhere in the world to consider Israel as their homeland. And it has produced a kind of hierarchy among Jews, where those that live in Israel and speak Hebrew look down upon diaspora Jews who forego the privilege of living in Israel and living Jewish tradition. So, and one of those Jewish traditions is that Jews enjoy a biblically sanctified right of return that goes back to their presence 2,000 years ago and has ever since been the source of Jewish prayers and ideas about returning to the promised land. So, in a kind of extraordinary and unique situation, both the Israelis and the Palestinians are deeply acted upon in their consciousness and in their behavior by a sense of entitlement to the land. For Palestinians, it's based on contemporary law and human rights and the long-term presence in the historic territory of Palestine. For Jews, it's primarily a religiously based claim that is given a kind of weaponized meaning in the contemporary global situation. Again, quoting Ben Gurion, he said, "The Bible shall be our weapon." And he said this way back in the early 1950s. And that's been part of the problematic situation, which has been disguised to some extent by Israel's sophisticated political discourse, which emphasizes which until very recently emphasized a willingness to search for some kind of mutually acceptable peace. And in some sense, in retrospect, the peace process was always somewhat suspect and was a kind of gesture to world public opinion that had long supported some kind of fair solution to this conflict of two peoples for one area of territory. And uh, this this process uh, was extended further by uh, large-scale Jewish settlement in violation of the rights of an occupying power under the Fourth Geneva Convention of that governs so-called belligerent occupation, Article 49, paragraph 6, where it is unlawful for an occupying power to establish any kind of fundamental changes in an occupied society through the transfer of its population to that society. And what has now emerged uh, in recent years and came clearest in the coalition government of Netanyahu that took power in January 1st of 2023, 10 months before the Hamas attack, was that this government, this Netanyahu-led government, which entered coalition with the most extreme maximal Zionists, was intent on extending Israeli sovereignty to the whole of the occupied Palestinian territory. And looking back on this Gaza operation that has occurred in the last 10 months, it is less, in my view, about security than it is about promoting the pre-October 7th vision of Greater Israel, which was envisioned in these extreme Zionist tactics and vision as the solution of the conflict with the Palestinians. But it couldn't happen without substantial dispossession in Gaza and especially in the West Bank, where the settler violence was given a green light from the moment Netanyahu, new government, took control in January of 2023. So settler violence was part of the background of the issue of getting rid of Palestinians in what amounts to a second Nakba. There were messages left on Palestinian cars by settlers that read, "Leave or we will kill you." And that to some degree has been a practice of terror sanctioned by the Israeli state. And so it's not only Gaza, but it's the West Bank that is part of the latest phase in this overall effort to crush what has been over the years Palestinian resistance and to disregard the legitimacy costs of disregarding Palestinian rights and consistently violating in these most fundamental ways international law. And what I finally want to make a few remarks about is the complicity of the liberal democracy, because they closed their eyes to Israel's disregard of international law up through this latest genocidal phase. And it amounted to a confrontation between the white West, global West, all of the supporters of Israel in these last months have been countries that emanated from British colonialism and broke away. Canada and the US, in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, in the Pacific. And all the actors that were pro-Palestinian were motivated by a solidarity with an Islamic political movement. So this was, in its broader understanding, a clash of civilization. And Iran was the only regional power that openly identified with the Palestinian struggle, aside from Turkey, which is outside the orbit of the Arab world, which is true, of course, also for Iran. But Iran has long identified with the Palestinian struggle and has been the enemy of Israel since its own revolution in 1978-79. So that tension has long existed, whereas in relation to Turkey, it's a much more recent development that really took its present form as a reaction to Israeli genocide in occupied Palestine. But this complicity of the liberal democracies extended to a unwillingness to insist that Israel at least comply with international law and international procedures. And one had the most respected legal institutions, especially the International Court of Justice, reach a near unanimous interim judgment that what Israel was doing by acting in this genocidal way and denying humanitarian aid to the population was a fundamental disregard of international law and morality. And the United States, above all other countries, asserted rather absurdly that South Africa's submission of a complaint to the International Court of Justice was without legal merit. And that attitude of suggesting that such a severe pattern of criminality lacks legal merit undermines international law for others, not only in this instance. And it identifies or confirms the hypocrisy of condemning Russia for its attack on Ukraine while acting in complicity in relation to the much worse acts committed by Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. So I want to conclude by saying that this issue of the right of return of Palestinian refugees, of which there are at least 5 million spread around the world, spread around either the world or these refugee camps, refugees and exiles, involuntary exiles, until that problem is fundamentally changed, fundamentally addressed, there will be no peaceful solution. And to address the problem, Israel has to, we have to imagine Israel as a different country, as a country that accords equality to all people, not the kind of Jewish supremacy that is claimed in the 2018 Basic Law of Israel, and even more so by the practices and policies that Israel has pursued since then. Let me stop and welcome your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor, for this very insightful presentation. So indeed, we have already two questions I can see. So one of our students asked the following question. From the early on, Zionist figures are against any right of Palestinians to return. Taking this into account, how serious were the Israeli leaders in terms of discussing this right of return in Camp David talks and several other peace initiatives? What was their motivation in these talks regarding the return issue?
I think one has to be very skeptical about the sincerity of the Israelis with respect to such pretensions of a willingness to find a satisfactory solution, because their behavior of increasing the settlements and uh, having this vision of the Zionist project being completed only when the entire promised land is fully integrated into Israeli sovereignty, and the idea of a Jewish supremacy state, all those concerns seem to me to undermine the credibility of any kind of peace diplomacy on the part of Israel and its leaders.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from Hajar Atabash. Um, what would be the repercussions for Palestinians' refugee status and the right of return, given the current crisis of implementation of the international law?
Well, during the if one supposes that international law will not be uh, imposed on Israel in a way that hasn't happened in the past, I don't see any satisfactory path to a solution. In other words, it's indispensable to a peaceful future for both peoples is a fundamental change in the attitude toward the right of return. And it probably would require a change in attitude toward the Jewish right of return as well as the Palestinian right of return and some equality of approach for both peoples.
Okay, thank you. So our next question, what do you think is the role of policymakers and, differently from them, the civil society in the Palestinian struggle at the moment?
Well, I think one can generalize by saying that it is disappointing that the Arab neighbors of Israel have done so little during this terrible period to support the struggle of the Palestinian people and to make more clear their commitment to upholding the basic rights of the Palestinians. The elites in these neighboring countries are closer to the West in their orientation than they are to their own people or to the Palestinian people. And they're threatened by resistance movements such as are associated with Hamas that don't give in to oppressive political conditions. As far as the global south is concerned, with a very few exceptions, the governments have also been cautious, feeling that the opposition to Israel is not in their national interest, either for economic reasons or for in response to leverage from the West, diplomatic leverage. The impressive exceptions come from South Africa, which is not surprising in the sense that Israel is an apartheid state, the main successor to the apartheid regime in Israel. And therefore, there's always been a strong identification between the new leadership in South Africa that goes back to Nelson Mandela and the present situation of Palestinians. The other exceptions are in Latin America, long victimized by American imperialism. Nicaragua has brought a complaint in the International Criminal Court seeking arrest warrants and investigation of the crimes committed by Israel. And Colombia and Chile, I think, have supported the South African initiative. And so it's only in the global South that one finds energetic efforts to invoke international law and to tangibly express solidarity with the Palestinian struggle.
Okay, thank you. So next question comes from Sema Karame. So she asks, what do you think of the potential impact of the Israeli protests against the Netanyahu administration? Would this change in this government or the replacement of it with a leftist one help change the nature of Israeli state now, Israeli state in the long run, and help the region reach a ceasefire currently?
Well, those are very helpful questions and understandable concerns. Um, I think Netanyahu, for reasons independent of the Gaza uh, assault, is very unpopular with the Israeli public. And he's blamed partly for not taking responsibility for the security lapse that allowed the Hamas attack to occur on October 7 and the failure to heed warnings that this attack was coming. There's increasing evidence that Netanyahu personally received a number of credible warnings, and that the nature of the Hamas attack was well known. And anyway, the situation where the very existence of Palestine had been uh, denied by Netanyahu when he appeared weeks earlier at the UN and waved a map of what he called the new Middle East before the delegates, in which there was no Palestine. In other words, Palestine was erased. And this was a deeply provocative act coming after the green lighting of settler violence and the encroachments on Al-Aqsa Mosque. So there is every reason to understand that a lot of Israelis hold Netanyahu responsible for the original Hamas attack, and they further hold him now responsible for failing to accept a ceasefire that would obtain the return of the remaining hostages. And as far as the being hopeful about the long range prospects of a transformed Israel, I don't think the evidence is present at this time. The probable alternative leadership would not be very different so far as attitudes toward the Palestinian struggle are concerned. There might be a more sensitive response to world public opinion, because Israel, among other things, has suffered an immense reputational defeat by this recourse to unlawful behavior climaxing in genocide. But in the long run, one can only hope that a more humane kind of politics emerges in Israel and happens before another explosion occurs in the region.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have two more questions. You know, yeah. So one of the questions comes from Said Duran, and he asks, "How do you see the future of the region in terms of demographics?" or demographical changes, let's say, especially after, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people within Gaza.
Well, I think that unless there are sudden changes that are not clearly predictable at this point, the demographic uh, future will probably be an extension of the present. I don't see any forces for dramatic change. And that would mean that the balances in the region will remain stable. The one caveat about that way of thinking is that there is the possibility, and it was um, given a concrete form by the assassination of Hania a couple of weeks ago, that Israel really wants to a wider regional war that engages Iran directly and involves the US as a partner. And that might escalate in ways that have demographic consequences. But again, it's very hard to speculate at this point as to what exactly they would be.
Okay, so one of our students, Ira Akman, she says some historians argue that while Zionism has been a very strong ideology for Israel, the Palestinians did not have, such a case. So such a flag to wage against Israel. So Israel used this as an advantage. So what do you think about this um, Zionism being at the core of Israel's existence, whereas Palestine suffers from the lack of such comprehensive ideology?
Well, I think in a broad sense, the Palestinians have suffered from a lack of unity. And as some of you may know, uh, a new attempt at unity between the PLO and Fatah was negotiated in Beijing and led to a declaration of unity in the struggle of the Palestinian people. These attempts have been made in the past, and they haven't lasted very long because there is a fundamental secular uh, religious divide in Palestinian political orientations, and there is to some extent, a Christian-Muslim divide among Palestinians, and more probably most consequential, the Israelis have understood that keeping the Palestinians from having a unified ideology is a way of keeping them divided and weak. So it's Israel's gone to deliberate and sophisticated extremes to prevent the emergence of any kind of ideological coherence and leadership unity. And this was, I think, most clearly illustrated by the Netanyahu role after the 1967 war in helping Hamas to get established in the first place as a way of weakening the PLO and creating a conflict with the Arafat-led Palestinian movement. So all along, Israel has sensed that one of its effective tactics is to prevent ideological and uh, resistance unity among the Palestinians. And they have been manipulated to a great extent as a result.
Okay, Mr. Professor Richard Falk, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We have learned a lot, indeed. I mean, so this is not one of the usual lectures about Palestine, but you have helped us to discover the historical, ideological, intellectual sides of the right of return question, and also providing a glance at the international law mechanism and how it works or why it doesn't work. So we are so grateful for your time, your participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your moderation, and it's a pleasure to have been your guest.
Okay.